This is Nature 6, and we're halfway through Nature, and we need now to reconnoiter as well as look ahead. Our inquiry is a syncopation of both process and form. Forms are very attractive. They have an electrical quality to them, but processes are different. They have a magnetic quality to them. It's very difficult for us because we have been inculcated for thousands of years to look to forms rather than to participate in processes. The greatest casualty in this would be nature, except that nature is not quite the casualty that experience is. Nature and mythic experience are two processes. They are not forms at all. And it's very important to make a deep distinction that has become more and more apparent now by the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century. All of the civilizations that have ever been made on this planet have ended. They have all died, and they all died from suffocation. The suffocation came because existence was put into straitjackets, and because the mind dominated experience to the extent that it was no longer able to flow as a process, and that nature was abstracted from to the extent that we were cut off. And so literally every large human form of society on the planet has died of suffocation. We are all precarious orphans. We have no shelter whatsoever in our lives on this planet from here on out unless we are able to make a new civilization, but a civilization that does not destroy experience preemptively, nor use a destructive experience to anesthetize nature, and to use a dominating mind to corral existence and existentials into untenable patterns. One of the most startling things is to discover that there is no chance in nature. The idea of chance is a mental idea. The experience of chance is inculcated from the mind. About a century ago, one of the great French philosophers of what was then described as primitive man, or natives, Lucien Levy-Bruhl, wrote a wonderful little book, How Natives Think, published in 1910. It was translated into English in 1926, and now is reprinted in paperback from Princeton University Press a century later because it's still basic and standard. A great deal of Carl Jung's early work was founded on Lucien Levy-Bruhl. Jung's great discovery that he was immensely attracted to African native life, that when he visited Africa, he found that he could very easily go native and become an African and live very happily there for the rest of his life. And it was a great difficulty for him to refuse to let that happen and to flee back to Europe. About the same time as Lucien Levy-Bruhl wrote How Natives Think, one of the most sophisticated men in European civilization, Albert Schweitzer, who had prepared to be a physician, a doctor, and who was one of the greatest authorities on Johann Sebastian Bach. He wrote a big 2-volume work on Bach's work, and he was one of the prize organists in Germany who could play Bach toccatas and fugues on the organ, left Europe and went to Africa and opened a little medical station at Lambarini and spent the rest of his life there, camped out on the, as he said, on the edge of the wilderness. Africa was called at the time by Europeans the Dark Continent, as if Europe were the bright continent. All of this is part of the early 20th century and its inability, to a large extent, to get outside of the mind's preemptive ideas about nature, which then were characteristically focused on 3 great areas in the world. One was Africa. Another was the Indians of the Americas. And another was the East Asian civilization centered on China. The primordial qualities of these huge populations were both way too attractive to some Europeans and very repulsive to most of them. And all of this has to do with an inculcating mind that is unable to be natural. There was a great interest in trying to rediscover one's origins, to go back to some kind of paradise, to a South Seas paradise, or to some kind of retreats. And even today, you find in the tourist literature of the world, get away from it all. Come back to something natural. Come back to experience something wild again. And all of this is a lingering hangover of several thousand years of civilization that increasingly, every time it was set up, suffocated those within its form. But the origins go back to the Neolithic, which for the last 10,000 years have increasingly made a gulf and a gap from the whole previous realm of existence, of life, the Paleolithic. It's important for us to understand that nature occurs. And it occurs not with some probability, but it occurs mysteriously. And that the mysterious process of nature occurring is one that is of change and not chance. It is change that is characteristic of the whole process of nature, and chance does not enter into the picture at all. Lucien Levy-Bruhl writes in one of the most striking chapters of his book, The Law of Participation. He says the current explanation of the phenomena like magic or mana or the mysterious primitive regard for nature, the current explanation of such phenomena consists of saying that primitives apply the principle of causality undiscerningly, and that they confound cause and antecedent, This would be a very common logical fallacy known as the fallacy of post hoc ergo propter hoc. The primitives, we are told, have not the least idea that this can be wrong. That the representations are consecutive in their minds is a sufficient guarantee that they are connected. Or rather, they do not consider the connection needs any guarantee. The observers themselves frequently suggest this explanation to natives. There is no such thing as chance. Occurrences which are close together in point of time, even if widely removed in space, readily appear to them to be linked by a causal relation. It is true, and later we shall discover the reason for it is that there is no such thing as chance to the primitive. In this section, Wise Levi-Bruhl shows that there is a participation. One of the caveats is that he makes it a law. Participation in nature is not a law. Participation in nature is a part of the resonance that is there in the change in the process. So that in the Paleolithic, not only our kind, but all of the precedent species of our kind, and all of the precedent species before their appearance, all the way back for hundreds of millions of years, have shown that the participation in nature is not at all anything to do with experience, with the mind, with logic or laws. And this is a very, very deep situation. The title of the lecture today is Gombe and Olduvai, or more properly, Olduvai and Gombe, since Olduvai came first. And it concerns the two women that we're considering now in our inquiry, Mary Leakey and Jane Goodall. It is a very deep lesson in humility, that which these two women constellate in their lives' works for us to consider here in the 21st century, especially because our most pressing strategic task is to generate a new civilization. But the new civilization needs to be founded on the participation with the mystery of nature and not upon the powerful intellectual ideas and principles, the constricted, suffocating experience models, and the supercilious assumptions about existence that are rampant everywhere. It's easy enough to criticize civilization, to be at fault and at blame, and especially in civilization that it is the powerfulness of the mind that is finally achieved in science, and that science is partly to blame, if not wholly to blame. And one finds a very intelligent book, this came out about 20 years ago, The Human-Animal Connection. 6 essays, the poet Gary Snyder, among them, published by Carnivore, Interfacing Biology. And it is a part of the publications of the Institute at Sierra Nevada College in Incline Village in Nevada, the north shore of Lake Tahoe. But excellent as the publication is in so many ways, one finds statements that seem to condemn science and condemn civilization for destroying habitats and species, and finally our ability to just appreciate them. And all of this works to a final great disadvantage. Participating in nature in the Paleolithic as we have seen, goes back millions of years. Forerunners to our species even before the hominine developments, all the way back to the very origins of our kind of primate some 70 million years ago. All of the indications are in by now that we have enjoyed a deep concourse of following in a participation with nature, following the plants, following the, as Jane Goodall discovered at Gombe, watching the chimpanzees. There are old experienced chimpanzees who know exactly every tree in the entire forest preserve, every bush, and know exactly when the fruits are coming in and that they're ripe, exactly where to go. And one of her favorite chimpanzees, a female named Fifi, that she's known for almost 40 years, knew her when she was the first little tiny baby to reach out and touch her nose out of curiosity. She is the one whose children are best at participating and knowing where these trees and these bushes are, where the fruit, the plants are, and to be wise about living as chimpanzees, participating in nature. The deepest error is to think that others think as we do. That primitive man doesn't really think logically at all because his mind just assumes that these representations in it, because they are connected together in some kind of time occurrence or related in some kind of spatiality, that the idea should be apparent to them of logical connections. And all of this is a projection of a flaw that runs like a crack through the entire bell of civilized forms. But the crack is not made by civilization, it is made by the Neolithic. The Neolithic era, where the taming of plants and the taming of animals led us away from the participation in nature and put the emphasis then on corralling and beginning to control, beginning to isolate and select plants and animals, minerals, herbs, ourselves, and the beginnings, instead of nature, of culture. And that culture has within it a very deep crack, a flaw, a gap from the natural. So that one of the concerns in all cultural experience, and all experience is cultural. All experience is cultural, and its images and its feelings are a process and not a form. And it is the process of culture that must be put into a kind of parallel with the process of nature for it to work at all. And so the deepest concern we will see in mythic experience, in the mythic horizon of feeling tones and language and images, is to make sure that the imagery of experience relates to the occurrences in nature. The first registry where this takes place is not in the mind, but in ritual. It is the ritual body that records the first forms of that alignment. Not so much an alignment, but a flowing together, so that we will see that nature and culture flow together if there is a ritual cycle that specifically selects to correct and allow for the flow of culture to be on top of the natural flow. But in no way is a culture participating in the mystery of nature. The participation in nature to a culture is a great danger, a great unknown. And there is a great fearfulness in all Neolithic societies. The whole horizon of mythic experience has a great fear of the unknowns of nature. The vast unknown spreads where there is no chance and there is no logic. There is only an ocean of change that happens mysteriously. And so all cultures use a kind of a magic or a mana to reestablish a parallel with the mystery of nature so that the flow can be even, for it is out of experience, out of the mythic horizon of imaged language, that the mind as a form, as a formal quality of objectivity comes, and as it comes into its emergent form, we'll see the symbols now align themselves with the rituals. They leap over experience because experience was sound, was valid, as the mind now retrojects on it. Experience was sound and fit in with nature because the rituals did their work, and the symbols now integrating those rituals will now take over the leadership. And so the mind becomes the boss of the entire cycle of life. And it is this arrogance, it is this hubris that increasingly leads symbol ritual alignments to control experience so that it will not flow outside of the aligned grids, and that nature must be more and more held in its place by selective taming of certain elements of it and of excluding other elements of it, especially excluding the mystery by letting the mysteriousness of the natural process be absorbed into a kind of initiatory experience that then leads the mind to consider that it has covered all bets. This entire scheme is a game. One can apply game theory to it quite adequately. And by the early 21st century, it's quite apparent that this indeed is a losing game. The first indications of game theory on this level were done during the Second World War, and the great intellectual figure who pioneered that was John von Neumann. Not only with the Rand Corporation, but with Los Alamos and a number of other places trying to apply nuclear weapons to the political economic strategies of the world. And what was found is that indeed all economic processes are subject to game theory as well. So that the entire realm of the mind's objectivity has, over the last 3 generations, been reprocessed and recalibrated to a control of minds capable of game theory, theoretical control, and that this led to a speeding up of the death of Western civilization. At the very same time that this was happening, individuals like Levi Bruhl and Louis Leakey, subsidiaries like Schweitzer and Jung, were shaking themselves, trying to go back and explore nature again on ever deeper levels. And we'll see when we finish Nature 8 and get to Nature 9, we're going to go back an even deeper step, a deeper plateau than the two before them. Our first 4 lectures in nature with Thoreau and the I Ching were all about going back to contact the primordial, the Paleolithic, in terms of civilization. And now these 4 lectures take us back beyond the origins of civilization. The origins of civilization are effectively no more than 5,000 or 6,000 years old. But the origins that we're looking at now are some 70 million years old. And out of that, the last 5 or 6 million years have been directly in an evolutionary line leading to ourselves. So at the very minimum, we're looking at something where the first 4 lectures took us back 6,000 years in time, and these next 4 take us back some 1,000 times beyond that, or some 1,000,000 times beyond that. And then the last 4 lectures will take us some billions of times beyond that when we get to Lynn Margullis's symbiotic planet and the discovery of the double helix structure of DNA by James D. Watson. So we're going in 3 giant steps back, not just back, but deeper, to take ourselves out of the false inculcated death cycle that has all but killed us off, all but led to the extinction of our species on this planet, has jeopardized life to the extent that the base of life is now precarious. Even the plankton in the sea are not refurbishing. The corals of the oceans are not refurbishing. The holes in the atmosphere are growing. Ultraviolet radiation with just a slight increase will make it impossible for life forms like our own to survive. All of this is in process now, and if not just checked, but needing to be transformed, this will be the last century of life on this planet. So we have, even though there are very few who are able to recognize, even now, at this late date, that the Liberty Bell of freedom of life on this planet has been cracked a long time. We're looking at Olduvai and Gombe, Mary Leakey and Jane Goodall, to try to position ourselves, to take ourselves back this second step, to go back deeper than the I Ching and Thoreau. That the I Ching in its origins was indeed seeded by Fu Xi some 5,000 years ago, because he was able to go from the Chinese Neolithic that was very chaotic in his day, and to go back and recontact the Neolithic and bring out of it the trigrams, which were not just symbols in his mind, but that the trigrams were existentially emerged out of the mystery of nature itself. They were direct. So that the trigrams were not a human cultural structure, but that they were, as the Chinese tradition says, a heavenly structure that comes into our very existence, our very life, and registers in our life, not necessarily in the mind. And that it wasn't until some 2,000 years later that you find the I Ching of the hexagrams. And the I Ching of the hexagrams, put together about 1200 BC, is a Neolithic book of how to tame change into the polarities of chance. And it brought a whole mythic horizon of experience into play. And so the I Ching structure was no longer the heavenly pattern, but was now the human pattern. The trigrams were no longer fire and water heaven and earth, but they were the oldest son, the youngest son, the mother, the father, the middle daughter, the middle son. And so the family structure of the hexagrams show that the Neolithic indeed, by 1200 BC, was in full swing, and yet the full swing goes back some 10,000 years. It was Fuxi who was able to penetrate through the chaotic Neolithic at his time and reintroduce vivifying Paleolithic, not symbols in the mind, but the kind of recordings of primordiality in the very existential life, in the body, as it were. The king immediately following Fuxi was Shen Nung, who reorganized the Neolithic so that it became ordered, was the emperor who taught how to farm right, how to do animal husbandry right. And Chinese civilization then was now not chaotically Neolithic, but was organized. The land became portioned out, and one had the beginnings of villages that had a specific kind of an order to them, a kind of an order that now experience could generate itself around. And the traditional way to talk about it was to imagine a pair of vertical lines and a pair of horizontal lines intersecting and making like a tic-tac-toe 9-part grid structure. The center of that structure was the well, and the 8 squares around it were the 8 families that jointly used that well. And this was the grid, the model for the village cultural life of the Neolithic. And the patrimony of the whole thing was not on the heavens, mysteriously in a natural way allowing for these images to come out of them, but that these images were stylized in experience. They were images now in the feeling-toned relationalities of the human culture, the structure of human culture, and it was out of that that the symbolic mind emerged, not for the first time, but just like Shen Nung reordering farming, so instead of being chaotic, it was now ordered agriculture. The land was now peppered with very similar village structures all over within the 4 seas. As soon as there was a densification of the complexity of experience, the new mind that came out of that was the new mind of a higher level of structure than the Neolithic agricultural, cultural ethos. It was the level of civilization. And the traditional author of that civilization is Confucius. Confucian China is no longer cultural, but is deeply symbolic, is deeply structured by the ordered experience because it is integrated by the mind's symbols, the mind's ideas, by thought. But just as Shen Nung reorganized the long-term Neolithic into an ordered Neolithic and made it more powerful, and that was triggered by Fuxi going back to the Paleolithic, the figure who went back to the Paleolithic just before Confucius was Lao Tzu. And the Tao Te Ching is very much like the trigrams that seeded the I Ching. It goes back to the original participation in the mystery of nature. And right away out of that comes, because it isn't that like Fuxi coming out of the confused Neolithic and going back to the Paleolithic and then bringing out a new quality. Lao Tzu came not out of the Neolithic, but came out of the confused civilization And so we have this phenomenon of waves of pattern that one can learn and one can follow. And like hunters after wisdom that we have become, we need to understand this is how life can occur, and we can get our nourishment in this way. We have been in a confusion that has been dubbed empire, as if empire was a stronger thing than a civilization. That just as there were kingdoms and then there's a king of kings that leads to civilization, so now there'll be an emperor of civilizations that will lead to a super empire, and that this super empire then will take over the universe. All of this is a confused inculcation, and part of what is being done here is what Lao Tzu did 2,500 years ago, to go back to the original mystery of nature and to re-emerge existentials and phenomena again pristinely. And out of that, to develop an experience which is founded on that rather than on the projective or retrojective qualities of a deadening mind, of a mind that is now so used to killing that it doesn't recognize that it is the most lethal predator on the planet. The mind is the flawed mind is the top killer in this whole ethos. Part of the difficulty is that appreciating this whole pattern has been elusive, and when one comes, finally, towards the end of the 20th century, Principles of Human Evolution, a core textbook, Roger Weir, he says, the fossil and archaeological records serve as the principal sources of evidence upon which human prehistory is reconstructed. Unless that evidence can be interpreted with some confidence, the reconstruction, however convincing, may not be valid. In recent years, a tremendous emphasis has been placed in understanding the multifarious processes that impinge on bones and stone artifacts that become part of the record. The science of taphonomy, as this pursuit is known, has revealed that the prehistoric record is littered with snares and traps for the unwary. And even more so, the symbolic mind in its fractured qualities since the Neolithic began 10,000 years ago is full of snares and traps and now crevasses that do not permit us to pass. The fractures are very, very deep, and one finds already, before any of this emerged in the sense of being a threat some 10,000 years ago, some 20,000 years ago, the preparation for this was always seen in the very highest Paleolithic art, the art of Lascaux. At the very end of Lascaux, the deepest part of the cave, was one of the great striking initiations into facing the mystery of the void of natural change in the darkness and living through it and coming out to understand that this is not what will kill you. Let's take a break. Let's come back to our inquiry is an inquiry for primordial learning, for re-emerging. And this is not so impossible as the mind would project. It is impossible on two different fronts. One is that the complexities are daunting to the mind, and in Roger Weir's Principles of Human Evolution, a core textbook, he writes in chapter 9 introducing a term of taphonomy, the pursuit of trying to bring all the patterns and all the records, all of the evidences together. A taphonomist in a pessimistic mood has been heard to argue that because of the countless complicating factors that can plant false clues in the record, the chances of reconstructing the past are virtually nil. And this is accurate. The chances are nil, and it is not upon chance that one can proceed at all. But this is only one front. The other front to it is a reduction, a logical reduction to absurdity. And the absurdity does not normally occur in culture as absurdity. It occurs as ridicule. It occurs as a regression back to childishness, so that one does not have the patience to persevere, nor the stamina to delve, nor the concern that discerns. Instead, one turns to ridicule, and in the Tao Te Ching, Lao Tzu says, in timeless wisdom from the Paleolithic, upon hearing of the Tao, the ordinary people laugh and make fun of it and scoff at it and dismiss it. Those of a more refined nature, upon hearing it, try sometimes to practice it and sometimes just completely forget about it. They're spotty. Only the very rare continue to accumulate penetration so that they learn. And this is very much the situation by 2004. The reduction to absurdity of a drift into childishness, or a projection of such a super complexity that one has to only take probabilities in a kind of a statistical dynamic, and that this is about the best that one can do, and no one will be able to do more than that because it cannot be pressed further than that. So in our nature, our concerns are for just a handful of individuals that pressed their long-term patience and accumulated penetration with great stamina. Individuals like Thoreau or Mary Leakey or Jane Goodall are extraordinarily rare. But they are necessary. They are necessary especially at that most difficult of thresholds, the beginnings of a civilization. And so here in 2004, we have about a decade to make the beginnings of a new civilization. And should that not obtain, that window, like a launch window, will pass, and it will become increasingly impossible for it to occur. Like Fuxi going back, or Lao Tzu going back, there are many times where that was repeated in Chinese civilization, so that going back became easier and easier to do, because there was not just a precedent and tradition for it, but because the way and the emergence from the way became a part of the life experience, a part of the lore of Chinese civilization, and it by the time of about 1,000 years after Lao Tzu resulted in a very great figure in Chinese history named Wang Yangming, who was able to bring both Confucius and Lao Tzu back within a refined Buddhist context so that all three threads of Chinese civilization were brought together at a pinnacle. It's usually characterized in philosophic history as Neo-Confucianism, but Neo-Confucianism is something from 500 years before, from Chu Shi. Wang Yang Ming is at the very high point in the 1500s, about the time of Leonardo da Vinci, of showing that there is a way to acquire wisdom by learning, and that though it takes a while for that cycle of learning to occur, one can do this. In the American experience, our access to the primordial several hundred years ago was one of great peril. In the 1600s, if one looks at the populations of Europeans who came to the United States, if you look at the numbers of people who came over on ships, and the numbers of times that they had to come over on ships, and then you look at the population figures, you realize that in the 1600s, 90% of the immigrants died within a few years. So that it took a long time. And in the 17th century, what was to become the United States had no traction whatsoever in life, because they had no traction in availing themselves of the mystery of nature. And consequently, almost all of the native inhabitants were savages, were primitives, were brutals. Or if they were tamed, they were cowed down by the church, by various political or other social means. And you do not find any way to get back to a penetration through to the Paleolithic until you begin to have figures like Thoreau. And it's only in the 1830s that you begin to have ways of there being white Indians who were able to go back to the Paleolithic as easily as Wang Yang Ming in the Chinese tradition. It became natural to have a kind of a natural history for the very first time. And out of this came a whole different comportment. It wasn't just that there are trees out there. Each kind had its own life cycle. Not just that there are animals out there, but one began to pay attention to the specific lifestyles of the animals. And it is this natural history that eventually became matured at its highest level in the Africa of the 1930s, about 100 years later. And it is a figure like Louis Leakey, who was like a Thoreau on a very grand scale. Instead of a Thoreau who was there at Walden Pond, Louis Leakey took himself increasingly to the Olduvai Gorge area in the Serengeti Plains of what was at that time German East Africa and became Tanganyika and Kenya. He was first taken there in 1931 by a man named Hans Reck, a German, because it was German East Africa. The Olduvai Gorge area had been discovered for the first time by a European only in 1913. And right away, some of the fossils taken out of it, taken back to Germany, caused minor sensation, and there were plans, of course, to have expeditions, but the First World War intervened. And then after the First World War, the British took over that part of Africa from the Germans, and it took a while for anybody to really mount some expeditions. And it wasn't until Louis Leakey went there in 1931 with the old Hans Reck, who had been trying to go there for 20 years, that he recognized something in a very much amplified Thoreau way. Just as Thoreau schooled himself to be a white Indian, to be at home in the forests in the way in which a primordial person would be at home, able to go back to the Paleolithic, who did not tame nature but followed it, who did not assess one's chances in nature but was able to live the change. And if one can live the changes rather than assess the chances, then the symbolic mind goes into its natural proportion and no longer dominates the scene. And because the mind symbolically no longer dominates the scene, it frees experience to be able to slip back into its affinity with nature as a process. And when experience returns back to its process, freed from the constrictions of false form, then between the two processes of nature and experience that are both en naturel, rituals comb themselves out and stop being doctrinaire and begin to take on the qualities of existence. They become existential selective actions, and they are distinct then from the enforcement of codes, from the inculcation of doctrines, from the impositions of ideologies. And when rituals become in the shared sequencing of existentials and nature and experience flow en naturel, you have then a whole different basis upon which integration as an ecology cycles itself. And out of this eventually comes the natural mind. And the natural mind has an ability not only to frame, but to understand that in its framing, the center is open, so that one can give a bounded objectivity, but it is a delegation that is not stamped upon experience or stamped upon nature, but it is tendered to the ritual comportment of actions, so that those ritual comportments of action now are open on both sides to the experience of experience and the nature of nature. And because those two processes now have a permeable membrane of a ritual comportment, they tend to exchange back and forth in terms of the balance that is natural and experienceable in terms of the actuality, in terms of existence. And the mind tends then to become oriented in its objectivity to being aligned with existentials and not with ideals, not with doctrines, not with ideologies, not with codes. One doesn't need principles and codes. When Louis Leakey took Mary Leakey for the first time to Olduvai, it was 1935, just a few years later. While he was a super Thoreau African, he recognized that Mary Leakey was even more vast than he was. Because while Leakey was a white African, he was raised with the Kikuyu tribe so that he was an elder of the Kikuyu tribe. He spoke Kikuyu before he spoke English. He dreamed in Kikuyu, not English. While he was an African who fit in with the African culture of the Maasai and the Kikuyu, he discovered to his great surprise, that Mary Leakey was more primordial than he was, because she was not at home in culture, however ancient the African tribal culture was. She was at home, having been opened up by her experience of Paleolithic art in France and her archaeological experiences in England. She was open to a much more vast array. And Louis Leakey, for the first time, realized that the two of them together formed a working pair, like a tuning fork, that should be able to return back to the nature of nature at Olduvai and to discover whatever was really there. From 1935 till 1959. That's 24 years. They found almost nothing. 24 years. But increasingly, as that long runway took shape, Louis Leakey, being a wise elder of a very ancient culture, began to appreciate that it wasn't that their set was wrong, it's that there needed to be a finer tuning to that arrangement, a finer tuning to that set. And while Mary Leakey, sharing that with them, kept tuning herself more and more refined, Louis Leakey learned that her refinement was on the basis of the animals and not on the basis of the tribal culture. That she went back to the animal level of life that was tens of millions of years old, whereas he was going back maybe 1 million years of African tribal culture, who knows? At that time it was supposed to be about 100,000 years. So that increasingly Louis Leakey paid attention to the fact that there is something in special women that allows them to go back not just to the Paleolithic of man, but back to the animal origins of the Paleolithic in life. And so increasingly, Louis Leakey looked around to find very special women who would be able to do this and add layers and add help to Mary Leakey's genius. She's the one that was out in the field, not him. She's the one that went out every day, not him. She was the one that was at home with the animals deeper than the Neolithic level that Leakey worked on. She was at home in the Paleolithic wild wisdom. And so in 1952, when he met a brilliant animal photographer, she had been working for about 20 years at that time as a photographer. Her name was Ylla, Y-L-L-A, Ylla. And in 1952, Ylla spent a year photographing all the animals, and Louis Leakey did the text, and it's called Animals in Africa. It's all about the Olduvai Gorge area, the Serengeti area. And this was published in London, 1954. It was a new scale of hunting, and Leakey says in here that Ylla hunted with a camera, with her camera, not with a gun. She did not hunt to kill, but she hunted to observe and to capture her observations, and to reserve all that for later deepening. And so her photographs of the animals became classics. And he observed in this that she would have to get closer to the animals to photograph them than a hunter would with his gun. And it required more courage. and dangers. And in fact, she was killed in India in 1955, photographing wild animals in India. But this book was the forerunner and precursor of Jane Goodall. Yila was not so much the model, but was like the first seed that would develop into Jane Goodall. Not just Jane Goodall, but there were 3 women who went into the 3 great primates. And we'll talk about them more next week. But the emphasis now is on how Jane Goodall emerged in between Mary Leakey and herself, because there were seeds like Yila in the early 1950s that set the beginning. It's not the tone, it's the pitch pipe note. And Leakey was deep enough as a tribal elder to be able to take the pitch pipe note and to hum the whole tone. And once one can hum the tone in a ritual way that is that of a membrane open to the mysteries of nature and open to the unpremeditated experience, a good tribal elder is able to let the Paleolithic mysteriousness course through his existence in such a way that his experience continues it. And not only can he take the pitch pipe note and then hum the tone, but out of it will come a chant. Out of it will become the ritual turned into rhythm, language, and one will be able to sing oneself the song that needs to be sung. This is the origin of sacred song. It doesn't come from the mind. It comes from the thrill of existence that has listened to the ineffable and hums the experientially discoverable in a new way. And so out of this, Mary Leakey, being enormously close, not only to Lewis in the ways that he was working and understanding his philandering, understanding this is how this kind of man is, she, rather than just resenting it and distancing herself from it, she more and more began to refine herself so that the animals and the animal level around her became more and more speaking to her through her ritual comportment. And that's why in July of 1959, after 24 years, she spotted a bit of rock, and she knew instantly it wasn't rock, it was a tooth. And found the remains of the jaw area and rushed back to camp with yelling in great delirium, I found him, I found him. And it was the first time ever that anyone found traces of the ancient origins of man. And knew it. And ever since then, the development has led so that there are now such things as whole textbooks on many different species and orders that are precursors to us that go directly back to the first great ape, the primates like chimpanzees and gorillas and orangutans. And that the study of the chimpanzees by Jane Goodall, she started there the very next summer from that discovery in July of 1959. Just the very next summer, she started at Gombe stream. Encouraged, she says, in her first book, In the Shadow of Man, in the shadow of man, not just early man, but the shadow that was like a precursor of all the different kinds of, not just hominines, but australopithecines and many other species that are very cognate to us, many of which were dead ends in terms of evolution, and yet there was not just a line. By now, as Lewin points out again and again and is intelligent now, it isn't the tree of life, it's the bush. That the development of the integral of life does not proceed by trees like logic trees, but there is a whole quality of branching, it's called now cladding, where the branching takes a pair, a set. Where there was one, there are now two. And the two, each one of those two becomes a pair, becomes two. So that the evolutionary structure is not that of a tree, but that of a bush. And out of that bush, what occurs is an integral synthesizing flame, and what it consumes will be vanished, and what survives that flame will live. And that selective sieving of just the few things that are able to live through that fire, through that flame, become the beginnings of the new quality of bush. And that evolution proceeds in this way, so that there's a very deep wisdom in the ancient Jewish vision of Abraham and of Moses, that God appears as a flame in the bush, as a fire in that sacred bush. And that image is an image éternelle and does not occur in the mind as a symbol that comes out of thought, but emerges all the way from the mystery of nature through the membrane of existence, through the open concourse of natural experience, and occurs in the mind not as a representation in the mind, but as a presentation. And symbols that are presentations are able to transform. Symbols that are made of representations tend to stop there and codify themselves, and they become the lines on the paper that lead to ideological codes, that lead to the inculcated structures that tyrannize life and kill civilizations. This is where the enemy is. It is endemic in the situation unless one is able to go back to nature. One has to go back, as Thoreau said, in wilderness is the preservation of the world. One of the deepest difficulties of our new civilization is that our primordial no longer just goes back to the origins of civilization, or the origins of the Neolithic, or even the origins of the Paleolithic, or even the origins of the ways in which evolution on this planet has happened. Our new primordiality is the cosmos. In every direction, it's almost 14 billion light years deep and growing. So our Paleolithic, our primordial, is on a scale maybe 1 billion times what it was ever, and that latest registry of scale was only about 2 generations away, and that was 1 million times what it was before anybody before. And so we live at one of these rises that are called in mathematics asymptotic. It's a line that rises so fast that it shoots off the graph before it gets anywhere. It's an infinity that's more like an exclamation mark than any kind of other punctuation. It's not a period, it's not a colon, it's not a comma, it's not an ellipse, it's an exclamation mark. When they first began to emerge out of the ancient Vedic rituals that had been there for many thousands of years, the Upanishads, when they first began to constellate themselves, they were very large. The Brihad Aranyaka Upanishad is about 700 pages. The Chandogya Upanishad is about 400 pages. They were huge. They were enormous. But in terms of what was there before, they were like the first neuronal patterns, the first thought, weather, cloud fronts that were presaging a new state of mind, a new state of civilization. And it took about 500 years for those to come down and finally just be 18 verses of the Isha Upanishad. And one can do that. Refinability is one of the marks of civilization. But it has to have a starting note that can be heard by someone who can catch the tone and can let that tone occur in their life, in their existence, in such a way that the mystery of nature and the fertility of experience flow as a ribbon directly into the mind. That's the only way that that happens. And so this education is an education where not only is the mystery of a cosmic nature mysteriously flowing and of an infinite experience fertile, but also a two-way street so it can come back the other way. Because it's only when consciousness can come back the other way through vision and through history that the mystery of nature finally becomes illuminated to such an extent that we receive the blessings of two different kinds of form, the forms of nature and the forms of consciousness, because civilization is a form in consciousness, not at all in the natural integral. Natural integrals stop with the mind's ideologies. With the mind's ideologies, unless those ideologies are resolved back in the solvent of the natural openness and fertility and become ideas rather than ideologies, and ideas whose symbols are transparent, then those ideas can learn, then they can refine. And one shifts from chance to change. One shifts not to ambiguity, but to ambidextrousness. A baseball player who is ambiguous cannot hit the ball. Somebody who's a switch hitter who's ambidextrous can hit the ball from either side of the plate. It's that simple, it's that difficult. All of the education in past institutions of society have been flawed since the Neolithic to stop our maturity at the integral mind. It never worked. It will never work. We will not have a chance again if we stop at the integral mind this time, not just with atomic weapons, but with the abilities to manipulate atoms and molecules and cells and DNA. There won't be anything beyond the 21st century. It's that simple. Part of the difficulty is that the pioneers, like the Leakeys, needed two different capacities to work together. It's like Fuxi didn't do it alone, he was always with Nu Gua. King Wen didn't do it alone, he always had his wife. There's always this tandem of two different qualities that come together, and they come together in such a way that it's not just that they fit together, it's that they exchange. It's the exchange that's there. It's like the fulcrum in the trigrams is not that the two orders of the trigrams, the Tao and the Te, are clear from the mystery of nature. It's that it's clear that at their centers they exchange, and each one's center is able to operate in each other's continuum as if they were natural to it. Because the reality in nature is that the mystery is all about exchangeability, and it's the exchangeability that ensures fertility. Experience is only fertile if its two orders of operation are able to exchange centers. One of the mysteries of nature is that all of nature is integral. In its center, no doubt, is the mind. But the other mode is differential, and its center is the cosmos, not the mind. And if the mind and the cosmos cannot exchange centers, neither of them are going to be fertile. Neither are going to be real. And so the cosmos is very interested every time there is a suitor available of a mind that's enlightened enough to know this and understand it. It says, this is not a hunter come to kill. This is someone come to learn. And that's the origin of a different scale of blessing from just getting what you thought you wanted. When Jane Goodall made her thanks, she said in her acknowledgments, I should have been unable to study chimpanzees or write this book without the help and encouragement of a great many people. First, of course, my gratitude lies with Dr. L.S.B. Leakey. It was he who originally suggested I should study chimpanzees, and it was he that found the money to finance my early field work. He who arranged for me to write up my results for a PhD dissertation at Cambridge. And last but no means least, it was through Lewis's recommendation that Hugo came to photograph the chimpanzees and became her husband. But it was also Lewis who led Jane's mother, Van Goodall, who wrote a book with him and was a lifelong friend, to accompany her. Because in those days, in 1960, a European woman could not go alone in Black Africa, out on the edge of who knows where. But with Leakey's great ties all over the world on many levels, with the elders of the tribes as an elder of his own tribe, with the financial backing of people like the National Geographic in the United States, with the backing of universities like Cambridge in England, with his whole African experience as not just a man, but as an elder of the nature of the culture and the continent. He was able to shelter like the residences of a target and allow for that center to be there. And it took her a long time. It took Jane Goodall more than 4 years of patience before she had anything at all to show for it. But it's interesting. It took Mary Leakey 24 years. It took Jane Goodall 4. And the way has been pioneered so that the resonances are there. It's just that all of this belongs to a chaotic melee that has not been given its chance to have the order of a great complementarity. And that's what this education is. It's like Fuxi or Lao Tzu going back and giving a chance for the fertile chaos to come back, not into an order, but into a self-arranging exchange complementarity that will allow us to go forward. More next week.